Greetings, Acolyte, and welcome back to the Ordo Grigio, the Emperor's secret society against the enemy that is unpainted models. Today, indecision takes the better of me, again, so we paint two commanders for my Loyalist Iron Warriors. While I layer on some Screamer Pink from Citadel onto the commander's cloak, a bit of backstory. In the last two videos I rescued some unloved models and transformed them into Loyalist Iron Warriors, and I actually ended up with a force usable in the 3rd edition campaign I'm running, but they were missing one thing: a campaign commander. I found a Warsmith on Cults 3D and printed him off, but I wasn't 100% sold on the model. So I rummaged in my bits box and found a Primaris Captain, which I used some parts to turn into an Iron Warrior. I couldn't decide between the two, so decided to paint them both up and decide, but I'm still torn. Druchii Violet is used to shade the purple areas, and I think it might only be the 2nd or 3rd time I've used a wash, other than black or brown on a model. I use this to darken down the recesses on the purple areas, though on the larger, flatter areas of the cloak it does tend to dry a little patchy, however we will neaten that up. Normally, Iron Warriors are a dour and utilitarian legion, however the title of Warsmith is highly honoured, as they are the ultimate Iron Warrior strategist and lead their marines into battle with cold efficiency. So with a bit of help I settled on purple for the exterior of the cloak and the model's loincloths. I imagine the Warsmiths as more commanders than heroic leaders, so I went for models with more commanding poses. Once the wash is dry, I come back in with Screamer Pink and add a layer of highlights to the cloaks. I thin the paint quite a bit and leave the darkened colour in the recesses. Having the cloak separated from the model like this really makes painting it a lot easier, especially when I get onto painting the interior of the cloak. By using thinner layers of paint, I'm able to build up the gradient and smooth the colour transition from shade to highlight. On the loincloth, where the folds are smaller and sharper, there's less room to build this contrast, and in hindsight, maybe spending an entire evening on cloaks before painting the rest of the model was a poor choice. It did get a bit nerve-wracking later on when painting the rest of the model. For a highlight, I mix in some pink horror into the Screamer Pink, roughly 2 Screamer Pink to 1 pink horror. Again, I keep the paint very thinned and apply a couple of layers, with each successive layer covering a smaller area, building towards the edges and sharpest folds of the cloth. At this stage, even with servo arms, they aren't exactly feeling like Iron Warriors. Though I'm only 1 purple in, there's time yet. For a second highlight, I add more pink horror into the mix, closer to a 50-50 now, and I focus down on an even smaller area. I didn't want to use straight pink horror, as I felt using pink would be a bit too far, even for Loyalist Warsmiths. To be honest, I could probably do a full video on how I did the cloaks and cloth for these models, but there's a lot more to paint on these guys than the cloaks and loincloths, like bolters and plasma guns. The interior of the cloak gets a base of Xandri dust, which apparently didn't record, and then I use some Avalon Sunset to pick out the Aquillas on the edge of the cloak. This may just be the Chaos player in me, but it still feels pretty wrong painting Imperial symbols onto an Iron Warriors model. And there's no spikes, or obliterators. Strange times. Though painting the Avalon Sunset onto these icons did give me an idea of how to highlight the cloak. Next I used Agrak's Earthshade to, well, shade the interior of the cloak. As it was going to be the inside and naturally in shadow, I was fairly heavy with the wash here, and in some areas it began to pool quite heavily, which on top of taking ages to dry, would also look pretty bad. So I cleaned my brush and wicked away the excess wash until I was happy with how much was left in the recesses. I followed the same process with layering on the base colour in successive thin layers to build it away from the shadows, holding the model in the orientation it would sit on the final model, so I could use my nice new more powerful lights to kinda cheat, because they actually showed where the light would hit the cloak pretty well. So top tip for working out highlights: big lights. Normally, to highlight Xandri dust, I would use an off-white like Rakarth Flesh, however it is quite a desaturated colour, so instead I mixed in some of that Avalon Sunset, the idea from painting the Imperial icons. This was applied much like the pink horror and mixed into the Xandri dust, but I chose to use a yellow rather than an off-white, as I wanted to keep the warm, earthy tones of the yellow-brown, rather than the coldness of an off-white. This would also help distinguish the cloak from things like banners or purity seals, which use very similar colours. For a random idea I had, while concerned my Iron Warriors weren't evil enough, I don't think it turned out too bad if I'm honest. Just a shame 75% of it is behind the model and you can't see it. After about 3 layers of highlights and 4 hours in total of painting cloaks, it was time to make them actually look like Iron Warriors. Following the scheme I've used on my other Iron Warriors, I start with Citadel's Lead Belcher. Where previously I dry brushed this over the entire model, I wanted the commanders to be just a little bit brighter, so I met in the middle with a semi-layer, semi-overbrush over the entire model, minus the loincloths, obviously. I was pretty careful around these painted areas, and that nerve-wracking "oh no" when you get close is why I normally paint models by standard rather than by area. It's a lot easier to clean up a base colour than a fully shaded and highlighted area. I had expected by the end of the Lead Belcher step to be able to choose a model, like I had with the Demon Princes before, ignoring one and completing the other. However, each step just made it harder to decide between the two. Both stand taller than my rescued Firstborn Marines, and both equally look like they could lead Iron Warriors into battle, whilst having their own personality and feel. Sticking with the metallics, Retributor Armour came out for all the banding on the armour and weapons. Whilst I've tried other brass and gold metallics, I find every time I'm looking for a brass or gold I go to this colour, and as much as I'd like to expand my colour range, if it works, right? Keeping with the scheme from the previous Marines, I also painted the top section of the power pack with the brassy gold, as I had done with the Firstborn in the last video. Small details like this help tie an army together, even if other areas of the scheme vary unit to unit. Realising how much work I had still ahead of me, I began a litany of faith that I wouldn't ruin these models, and moved on to the Primaris Captain. 2nd and 3rd edition had mastercrafted weapons, normally represented by gold detailing or plating, so I replicated that here on the bolt rifle, which you can tell I'm concentrating hard because I forgot how to keep the model in focus. Then onto the power pack. I actually combined the printed power pack servo arm and one of the vents from the Primaris Captain's backpack so that the 2 packs would be different between the 2 captains, and I also think the plasma gun just looked a bit weird on the Primaris Captain. The Primaris Captain is probably one of the most modern miniatures I have, and you can really tell the difference in detail between this and the Firstborn Marines from last video. And yes, painting the dangle canister thing worried me very much, being right up against the loincloth. Zandri dust again to block in areas for hazard stripes, such as the shoulder pad, even if it's not technically stripes. I had the idea that over time the chevrons of the hazard stripes might become almost like heraldry to the Iron Warriors, so the shoulder pad would be a variant of the design, and this Warsmith's own motif. It does look just a bit weird in the end result though. Sometimes you just gotta try something out. I also use this as a base for all the parchment on the bolt rifle and the purity seals on the bolter, which won't be highlighted yellow. And onto the straps and rope on the Primaris Captain, again having a mild aneurysm painting next to the purple loincloth. Matte black from Army Painter next for the hazard stripe motifs on both Commander's shoulder pads. I thought with the texture on the shoulder pads it would be easier to paint, but much like Rokal Dawn or Horus, my hand betrayed me on the printed Warsmith anyway. The lines did help on the Primaris Captain though, and it only needed a little bit of touch-ups before I was happy with the stripes. Perhaps I will stick with the standard chevrons for a while, as the stylised ones took a few goes back and forth to get them right. Leather brown was next for straps and pouches I wanted to be more of a leather colour, and in hindsight this may have been a good choice for the inside of the cloak too. A solid layer went down on the strap for the bolt rifle, as well as the pistol pouch on the commander's hip. Models having sidearms is a fairly modern 40k convention, and I find it quite interesting how tabletop miniatures also follow conventions of real-world military tactics, even when set in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war. To cement these models in the same world as my other Iron Warriors, I also apply the leather brown across the bases, which will be the same wet, marshy mud. Though I kept the weathering on the boots lighter for these models, as I imagine commanding the forces requires slightly less running about in the mud than fighting on the front lines, though you still won't stay completely clean. Mephiston Red next for the wax part of the Purity Seals. I imagine Iron Warriors use Purity Seals more like Oaths of Moment or a tally of grudges than Litanies of Faith though. Like the other Iron Warriors, I use this to paint the lenses of the models, and definitely didn't get annoyed by the gap in my curtains flapping around and changing the lighting in the area, and then pin my curtain to the wall with thumbtacks. I also used this red on the trailing cables on the weapons and servo arms, just getting a nice solid colour. Another small detail that will help tie these models in with my firstborn. Initially I went to paint the cables on the power pack red too, but next to the Retributor armour it looked a bit garish and cartoony. So I changed my mind, which, given the entire subject of this video, probably isn't that surprising, is it? Especially if you've seen the Demon Prince video too. Avalon Sunset comes out for the third time this video, and I use this to highlight the now tidied up chevrons on the models. With this I make sure to leave some of the Xandri dust showing in the recesses, and I think this yellow is a little bit warmer in tone than the demonic yellow I used before, so it gives a more grounded feel, which suits the Iron Warriors very well. Though I haven't compared them side by side yet, so hopefully it's not too dissimilar. Rakarth Flesh from Citadel is used to highlight the banners, Purity Seals and ropes, again leaving some Xandri dust in the recesses. On the bolt rifle it was a strange process, as I was essentially painting it upside down from how it would be on the model, so I ended up flipping it over. Another time where having a little handle helped me out a little bit. Rather than catch the individual folds and strands of the rope, I focused this highlight into the centre and on the edges, as a wash would get the recesses for me. Next I mixed Mechanicus Standard Grey with matte black, until it was the shade I wanted for the ribbing between the armour joints. I wanted it to read as an almost off-black rubberized material. Now this was a step I missed out on the firstborn Marines, as the amount of time invested versus the overall improvement didn't really seem worth it for what little joints were exposed on the models. However, on a commander where I'm bumping the quality up a notch, it's definitely worth it. I also used this colour for the pipes on the power pack, and a few other details I wanted black rubber instead of red, bringing back a little of the utilitarian feel for the commanders. Agrax Earthshade again to wash the entire model. I chose this colour because it matched with every paint I'd used so far, and was a bit more subtle than Nuln Oil, especially over the Lead Belcher. The only areas on the two models I didn't use this on at this point was the Primaris Captain's cloak, the leather brown on the base, and the bones on the Primaris Captain's base too. Though I do find it quite fitting that both commanders have body parts on their bases, and are part of a legion once known as the Corpse Grinders, mostly for their reputation for expending Imperial lives to deplete enemy ammunition stores. What else are the Imperial Guard for, right? Once the wash is dry, I assembled the Primaris Captain and got matte white out for areas I wanted plasma or glowing. Then realised the tiny crotch bottle was underneath the bolt rifle, so I had to break it off again. I layered the paint onto the windows of the vial, honestly I'm still not sure what to call this, and onto the lens of his bionic eye. The printed Warsmith got this on the barrel and coils of his plasma gun, ready for the next step. High Lord Blue, a speed paint from the Army Painter next. I begin layering this over the metallic head of the power hammer. I thought this would make it like a cool metallic blue, but looking at it now, maybe it wasn't the best idea, and I'll probably end up repainting it in the future. But for now, it's good enough to be a power hammer, until I come up with a better idea anyway. I then applied this to the areas I painted white in the previous step. I'm using a reasonably large brush for this, as any of the paint that goes over will help sell the glowing effect, and by settling into the recesses, as speed paint does, it will leave the central areas lighter. Just try not to paint too much onto the brass. I begin our last few highlights, beginning with Rakarth Flesh. Now the bolt rifle is in place, I can focus on the upper portions without turning my brain upside down, and I'm quite sparing with these, only catching small areas of the rope, like an edge highlight but lazy and on a rope dangling across a chest. Avalon Sunset, 4 times now, going over where we used it before but covering even less, this time on the shoulder pads, focusing towards the peak of the curve and the upper edges of the chevrons on the backpack. I even touched the small Aquila just a little, for a tiny highlight, though you can't really see it. Then Mephiston Red for the raised surfaces on the Purity seal, and buttons on his forearm, though I'm not convinced I actually deposited any paint on those buttons. A final highlight of Steel Legion Drab, basically identical to Leather Brown, for the strap and the pouches. I focused this on the edge of the strap, as much of the strap itself is in shadow, though I did leave a couple of scratchy lines at the rear to try and hint at texture. The same is done to the pistol pouch, drawing the highlights out from the centre, leaving the lines in to add texture. Finally, onto the bases. Like before, a mix of Darkwood speed paint and gloss varnish in a roughly 7:5 ratio, and this adds a nice wet mud look. As this was the final step, I was pretty nervous with this, especially around the Primaris Captain's cloak. Imagine spending 4 hours on a cloak and then getting homemade mud effect on it, jeez. I tried to stay away from the bones and the detail on the bases, however I didn't try too hard, as any of this that got on that part would just read as wet mud on the object, though anywhere I wanted to clean up I wicked it away with a damp brush. Once I got near the severed head of the guardsman on the printed Warsmiths base, I added some blood red speed paint into my palette to make the decapitation seem recent and like blood was soaking into the mud, mixing in with the marshy soil. I did apply it a little too much onto the face though, and spent way too long wicking it away because I kept spreading it, and he went a little bit pink and embarrassed for a while. Though I'd be pretty embarrassed if my head got chopped off, so we can't really blame him too much. With the effects all dry, they look like this. So here we have our 2 candidates for Warsmith, which I can't choose between by myself. If you have any preference on which Warsmith should lead my Iron Warriors in battle, feel free to leave it in the comments below and help me decide. And much like the Vindicator, I am open to name suggestions. Eventually, the characters from the campaign will be written up into the lore for the campaign booklet, so there's a chance it might end up in a random Word document posted on Google Docs, I guess. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions for future videos, I'd love to hear them down in the comment section below, and I'll see you all next time.